Welcome to another episode of the Arter Project. I'm your host, Nick Garter, and today we're joined by another exceptional and interesting guest, Ross Sullivan. Ross, how are you doing today, man?
I'm doing well. Yeah, excited to be here, man. Thank you.
Yep. Ross is a member of the Center for Psychedelic Education, or CPE. CPE is an infrastructure for psychedelic ecosystem that provides community, education, and equity for the psychedelic ecosystem. Ross, could you tell us a little bit more about yourself and how you were first introduced to psychedelics?
Yeah. So I was first introduced to psychedelics many years ago when I was in college. I was a freshman in college and had my first psychedelic experience. And actually, in many ways, I would say this journey has taken me where I am now has almost been a product of that and a larger like process of integration of that. That first experience for me was pretty intense. And at that time, I considered it to be a bad trip. It was a really beautiful experience to start with. And then what I would call the ego dissolution started to come on pretty strong. And I became very fearful that I was dying, that I was literally dying. And it was a high dose, and it was like pretty recreational in the sense that I was just in a dorm room with a bunch of friends, and not the best setting to be experimenting with psychedelics. And so that was really my first like experience. It was pretty intense, and that didn't deter me from having other experiences. I had several after that, and all of them, however recreational they were pretty significant experiences for me, and often what I would say mystical, spiritual experiences to at least some degree. And so I carried that with me for, a good 15 years now. And those have informed a lot of my worldview and a lot of how I think I've grown to operate in the world. And so that led to like several years of not really using psychedelics that often. Eventually led me back to psychedelics, and I got into the space a few years ago. So I spent about 6 years working in health and fitness and as a holistic lifestyle coach. And so I ran a few gyms, CrossFit gyms, and selling personal training, that kind of stuff in the Harrisburg area. I reached a point I had left those positions and started my own business, and wasn't as successful as I had hoped to be, and maybe made some poor choices on that path. But it eventually led me to a place where I was like, I had this sort of failed business. A relationship ended, and I was going through what I call a midlife crisis at the end of 2018. And I decided to stop. I was privileged enough to be able to stop working and travel for a little bit. I went to Australia. And when I was in Australia, I had several psychedelic experiences.
Wow, that's cool.
That were pretty formative, I think, for me at that time and for what I was going through. And that ultimately led down to this trajectory of where I am. And a few years of traveling, and now what I would consider to be a sabbatical from work. A lot of really like exploration, spiritual exploration, and using psychedelics too. Some big experiences with ayahuasca that were really important to me. And that led me ultimately to a few mentors in the space, Dr. Dan Engel and Dr. Joe Tafur, two really important ones for me specifically, that I learned a lot about. I was able to learn enough to start to blend my background in health and fitness and holistic lifestyle with the work with the medicine, and started to orient towards helping others to integrate and prepare. I think a lot of people, when they enter the space, we tend to think of like, how can I get involved in, a lot of people look at becoming a therapist or a practitioner of some sort. And I wasn't quite qualified for that and didn't want to go back to school. So leveraging the knowledge and background that I already had, I got into integration and preparation and started doing some of that work. So that was then early 2020. And that led me down a longer journey, which I'll get into, or I can get into maybe a little bit later, but I'll stop there for now.
Got it. So, man, that's awesome, man. That's cool. In particular, I always find it like really cool when people have psychedelic experiences like in other countries abroad, countries that, may have had, an indigenous history of using the substances as well, and there's a lot more, sometimes more ritual or sacredness placed on the plants in other countries. One question I did have for you is, you mentioned you've had multiple mystical experiences. What is a mystical experience? And can a person that consumes the substance, can the observer, call their own experience mystical? How do you know if it's a mystical experience, and what does that mean?
That's a great question. And I may not be the best person to answer that question, but I'll give it my best shot. I think that a mystical experience, well, first of all, there's mystical experience questionnaire that is used in some of the research. I think it was created at Johns Hopkins. So there's a questionnaire that has several questions that would then help to decide whether a person has had a mystical experience with psychedelics. But often it's some sort of contact with what we would call the divine, some sort of maybe sense of, the unity of all things, or an interconnectedness between ourselves, nature, all different parts of our reality. Some people have mystical experiences where they'll see, I've heard stories of seeing different deities that maybe come from a religious background, or, having conversations with God or with a higher power. So, yeah, I think I would say that a person having an experience like that could, if they feel that it was mystical of nature, or that it was like in some way maybe a religious experience, or like a divine experience, they could call that what it is themselves. Like that's a personal thing, and something that really I think one can only decide for themselves. But maybe like using a questionnaire or having some other signifier might be able to illuminate that for somebody and say, oh, this is what that was. Yeah, but for me, some of those experiences were just intuitions that ended up coming to reality, some visual experiences sort of showing that interconnectedness, and feeling this deep sense of like love and beauty of existence, and even beyond our perceptions of this reality. So yeah.
Yeah, 100%, man. Mystical experience. I think the questionnaire that you mentioned that they use at Hopkins, yeah, one of the questions, or one of the hallmarks of the experience, is that it's ineffable, right?
Yes.
So it can't really be articulated. So it's always interesting, like, to hear. It's hard to. It's very difficult to explain. It's just a feeling and an intuition, like you mentioned.
Absolutely.
But they do say, mystical experiences, especially, as we use these compounds, we're maximizing their therapeutic potential to treat mental illness. There is a link between the mystical experiences and how well your mental health, has the potential to improve. I think Hopkins found that, like, they kind of like try to push for that. They try to like create the setting to where someone does have a mystical experience, because that tends to help with the depression or anxiety or PTSD that someone could be going through.
Yeah.
Well, now, Ross,
Totally.
one thing that I did find interesting is you mentioned your first trip, you had a bad trip, your first experience with psychedelics, and yet you still decided to try psychedelics again after that. Can you speak about like why? I feel like most people, if they had a bad experience, they'd say, "I'm done. I don't want any more any parts of this."
Yeah.
But what kept you going and made you decide to try psychedelics again? And also, what did the bad trip feel like? Like, what was that experience like?
Yeah, I mean, the first word that comes to mind is stupidity, right? Right. But that's also not true. It's more curiosity. I think I had that experience, and like I said, the beginning of it and parts of it were really, really beautiful, like a very beautiful experience. And so I was curious, and I wanted to explore that again. I'm a very curious person by nature. And so having had that experience, I wanted to kind of go back in and see what it was all about. And I was definitely afraid. And I even then sort of shifted. That was with psilocybin, with mushrooms. And that sort of led me then to explore LSD a little bit more after that experience. And just, I think there was, I don't know, must have been a part of me that knew that there was something in there for me to continue to explore and to find. And maybe a little bit of stupidity mixed with destiny. I don't know, but it was painful. The quote unquote bad trip, the negative experience was a lot of fear, a lot of anxiety, a lot of I remember, and I recently shared this with my mom, like I felt like I was dying and I just wanted to call my mom, but I knew that I was
Yeah.
like tripping and that was probably not a good idea. So I just kind of wrote it out, put some comfortable clothes on, got under the covers, and just like, kind of held on for dear life for a little
Yeah.
while until it started to subside, and then really sit with like, what was that? What was going on? But yeah, like I said, then I think it's been a lot of that has informed the last 15 years even of my life.
That's awesome, man. I mean, I always think about for myself, I know like a lot of people do have psychedelic experiences in college. And I always think about my life in particular. I just don't feel like I was like evolved or like mature enough back in college to like, I'm not sure, like your brain, what they say, your brain doesn't fully develop until like 25 or 26 or something like that.
Right. Yeah.
I always think how, I don't know how I would have been able to interpret those experiences at a young age. One thing you did mention is for folks who are considering psychedelics in college. One thing you mentioned is the critical importance of set and setting. Set and setting is everything. It can make a huge difference between whether you have a good trip or you're feeling like you're dying.
Yeah.
All right, Ross. So let's get a little bit into the work that you're doing now with the Center for Psychedelic Education and CPE. Can you talk a little bit about CPE? What type of work that you guys are involved in?
Yeah, absolutely. So CPE is a multi-stakeholder member-led movement, and we're facilitating community education and equity for the psychedelic ecosystem. And I'll give a little bit more backstory of how we got to this place. That's kind of like the baseline of what we're doing, and then some words to throw out there. But as I mentioned, I was doing some work as an integration practitioner. So mostly with folks that were preparing for and then integrating ayahuasca experiences. And I was, during that time too, I was still integrating my own experiences and learning a lot. And there was a moment in time where I had this like strong shift of perspective from myself to the sort of collective wider lens, and not just myself but also the individual lens that we tend to look at psychedelic healing through. And so I was really like contemplating the question of like, okay, if we're sort of touting psychedelics as a community to be these revolutionary therapies, these massive innovations in mental health treatments, it was like, how is that possible inside of the larger systems that are actually necessitating us to heal from? So the systems of oppression and supremacy and capitalism and patriarchy, all of those things that really, there's evidence and research that shows that those things actually lead to mental illness. Those systems and the inequalities that they create. And so I started to really think along those lines, and then shifting out of the wanting to work with individuals and on integration and looking at this wider cultural integration. And so I was a part of some really interesting conversations about like, hey, we want to be building this industry with ethics and values centered, and avoid some of the pitfalls and forces of capitalism that like cannabis has gone through and other industries have gone through, and that the pharmaceutical industry is sort of plagued with, but not really knowing how. And so I had some ideas that like led me to collaborate on some projects with organizations like North Star in the psychedelic space. And so through that experience, and then got into some advocacy work here in Pennsylvania, and myself holding that question and a few sort of seeds of ideas of things that I wanted to do, and then connecting with some other advocates and folks that had started businesses in the space. We started to notice some gaps mostly in education to start with, and then also in this idea of like collaboration and cooperation. Like how do we as a community all play well together to do this hard thing of building out the infrastructure of psychedelic assisted therapy within our healthcare system and not do it well, right? So we sort of came together and addressed or noticed some of these gaps. So gaps in like general education. There's still so much stigma out there around psychedelics and psychedelic assisted therapies. And a lot of that stigma also spills over into our policymakers and lawmakers. Like those folks are still really part of the general public. And often, in my experience, lack the education necessary to be enacting laws and to be passing bills and these types of things around the country, to be bringing psychedelic medicines to their constituents. And so we really wanted to start by educating general public and lawmakers. And then we started to look at, okay, this question of how can we all play well together? What are some structures that we can build organizationally to facilitate that? And then it sort of evolved into this question of like, oh, actually, maybe through this we can start to build some infrastructure for the care systems, the local care systems that are going to be necessary to integrate these and to make them accessible in communities. So that was some of the seeds that really led to CPE, and now we're focused on three main pillars: so education, community, and equity. And the education piece, like I said, became really this idea of like, what is the education that's necessary for building out this like next healthcare system that we're calling it now. And so there's levels of education that we see to that education, purely basics, like for the general public, like, part of the work that you're doing, like what are psychedelics, what are the benefits, what are some of the like harm reduction principles that can be learned about, and just raising awareness around psychedelics. And then also education for the folks that are already in the space, that are building communities around this and that are active in their community, through setting up clinics, different aspects of care systems, peer support, those types of things, that want to be able to participate in this growth, in this movement. So we're looking at those two levels of education. And the third piece too is like really looking at the systems change. Like, what is the geopolitical and systems change that can come through integrating psychedelic medicines into our culture at large? So that's the education piece. The community piece is right now a collective of individuals and organizations in the space, mostly based in Pennsylvania so far, but we're expanding nationally and bringing together, creating this sort of peer network platform where folks can start to organize and prioritize and mobilize around different advocacy efforts or healthcare system infrastructure building, different like working groups essentially that we can organize towards specific goals within the space, and just a space for sharing, for collaborating, those types of things. And then the equity piece, we're looking at how can we mobilize capital in the direction of equity. And so that we want to set up some sort of capital vehicle for women and BIPOC individuals in particular. So from two perspectives: one, creating more access to the treatments themselves, like as patients, so to speak, and then also more access to business opportunities. And so we're exploring like, what are the ways that we can do that and mobilize capital in those ways.
That's awesome, man. This is extremely, extremely important work.
Thank you.
Extremely important work. I really like how you guys are focusing on the infrastructure, because psychedelics are a big idea. They're a big idea for our country and society at large. And it's absolutely imperative that we focus on the infrastructure in order to really think about the best way to administer these compounds and what that looks like. What does the integration process look like? We're writing the rules right now. Everyone is writing the rules in this space, and we're really trying to map out what the next 5 to 10 years and beyond will look like.
Yeah.
And that's extraordinarily dope. What would you say is like the biggest accomplishment, that you've personally been a part of, or just the organization in general? What would you say is you guys' biggest accomplishment?
I mean, just the fact that we're doing real work in the space is I think a massive accomplishment. But yeah, some of that work, in June, we had an advocacy and education event at the state capitol here in Pennsylvania, in Harrisburg. So that was our Pennsylvania Psychedelic Education Day. And we had a press conference at the Capitol with a handful of veterans and advocates from around the country, really, but also locally to Pennsylvania, and some of the lawmakers that are forging some of the legislation here in Pennsylvania. So that was a huge success, that event. And some of the advocates and some of the veterans made some legislative visits too, that was a little bit separate from CPE, but in conjunction with our event. But yeah, to start to get in front of these lawmakers and tell them their stories and like why this is so important and why we really need to care about this as a country. So that was a huge success. We have an upcoming event in Pittsburgh called EntheoCon, which is going to be a conference that is it's by the community for the community. So it's
Yeah.
going to be a lot of local to Pittsburgh folks that are involved in the space speaking on panels, and then a lot of like community involvement. So participation and engagement from the audience, a little bit different than some of the conferences that we see in the space where you just kind of show up and listen to other people talk at you and throw a bunch of information around. We want to make it
Yeah.
as participatory as possible. And we're planning an event a broadcast event for Indigenous Peoples Day here coming up, which will be like kicking off the Horizons Week in October. And
Oh,
then
wow. Cool.
so that's I think a really important thing to do just in general in the space. And there's some other projects that are a little bit behind the scenes right now that I'm really excited about. But yeah, so those events and that kind of stuff, and the fact that we were like alive and have an organization and can provide information and connect with people is a huge accomplishment in and of itself.
100%, 100%. Adding to the body of knowledge and the Renaissance. Now, for the audience who may not be aware, it's crazy. Ross mentioned that he was actually at the Capitol in Pennsylvania. Ross is actually from my hometown of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, which is really, really cool. I'm based in DC, but originally from Harrisburg. It's just really cool seeing that work being done in my hometown. Would you say that, like, I mean, it's early and, PA, I guess PA is a purple state. Would you say that does it look like lawmakers may come around to the idea of perhaps decriminalization, or, is the state having any type of conversations? Are there any conversations on, decriminalization in PA at all?
So not decriminalization, but there is some definite movement on policy. So there had been a bill introduced last summer, that was to essentially open up Pennsylvania for research of psilocybin, specifically natural psilocybin.
Fascinating.
That bill was presented or introduced by Representative Tracy Pennycook out of the Pittsburgh area. I can't remember exactly where she's from, and Representative Jennifer O'Mara, based in the Philly area. And so they had that bill introduced. It got stalled in the health committee where it was introduced for a while. And they essentially have tabled that bill and have some plans for a new bill, which is going to be similar to, and I don't know if it's exactly those two representatives that are specifically involved with that anymore, but there was significant bipartisan support for that first bill, right? So there was like close to, I think, 20 total House members that on board, and we really thought it was going to get passed through, but it got held up. And that was one of the things where we were like, oh, there's still like stigma within the lawmakers, within their offices, that they don't want to do this for whatever reason.
Yeah.
So yes, there's been a lot of support, and there's movement on something similar to what's been passed in Connecticut, which is an expanded access program for MDMA and psilocybin.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, basically that will create some research opportunities, and through that, what is called expanded access for veterans and first responders and folks with PTSD and some of the other indications that would be studied.
Yeah, man, that's incredible. The research, there was a research amendment, or an amendment to allocate additional funds for research at a federal level. I think that was approved last week.
I saw that. Yep.
It's so interesting, the bipartisan support that psychedelics actually, they might have, right? Like right now we're in a space, obviously, where Democrats and Republicans don't agree on anything. But it's pretty promising. I think particularly with the veterans, the support by veterans for, that have PTSD and the help that they receive from psychedelics, that's opening the mind for a Republican at the state and federal level to a certain degree. It's just surprising, and it's really cool to see, especially that amendment that was passed last week. That was pretty cool to see some bipartisan support in the space.
Yeah, I agree. It's really, it is really fascinating. And, one of my biggest fears for the space is this sort of culture war that we've got going on, and that psychedelics could fall victim to that. But so far we've seen a lot of momentum in the other direction, and I would imagine continue to. And, it's when you hear the stories from veterans and from the folks that their lives have been changed, and some even saved through psychedelic assisted therapies outside of the country, it's really hard to discredit that. And it's really hard to look the other way and say, like, no, you know what, we shouldn't do this, because like these are the constituents, like these are real humans that are coming to with
Mm,
like really impactful stories. And, I think it becomes undeniable, I think, to an extent. And for somebody to turn their heads against that is really, really indicative of, I think,
state of
where that,
consciousness.
yeah, where that person is, and the
Yeah,
empathy that they have, and
one
those guys.
hundred, 100%, man. 100%. It's black and white. It's black and white. And that's why I do think this renaissance was inevitable and will only continue to grow and gain steam from here. I want to back up a little bit, Ross, and focus a little bit on the integration that you mentioned earlier.
Sure.
A lot of your work is focused in integration. I would like for you to speak about the significance of integration after a psychedelic journey, and also the particular, I guess, tool or process that you implement is IYA, which is integrating your awakening. If I'm getting that right. I had never heard of that before. So, could you talk a little bit about the importance of integration and also what IYA is important in particular as an integration technique?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, integration, I think it's important to first mention that integration starts before the experience. It
Mm,
starts with the preparation. And to some degree, an individual's ability to integrate their experience is predicated on the care and the intention that goes into the preparation. And so that preparation can be, yeah, with ayahuasca, there's a dieta, there's a diet, there's
mhm.
certain things that you're supposed to eat and not supposed to eat, and limiting information that you're taking in and the sources that they're coming from, and like maybe books that you read or music that you listen to. Like the diet can be anything that you're taking in: information, food, you know, alcohol, drinks, those kinds of things. So yeah, it all starts with the preparation, being prepared to go into the experience with your intentions, or with your, whatever you're looking to get out of it, even if it is more of a recreational experience or a fun experience, still going into that with the mindset of like understanding that this isn't necessarily something to just like take for granted, and that you're going into a possibly delicate or vulnerable space, and having a reverence for that regardless of the true setting. And then when you come off of that experience, it's like, one, it has to do with your intentions. What were you looking to get out of it? What are you looking to get out of it? And then it has to do with like, how can I implement, oftentimes we have an experience where we find some sort of like piece of gold, or something that we want to hold on to, maybe an insight or a realization or whatever that might be, that we want to take that from the experience and bring that into our daily lives. And especially with therapy, psychedelic assisted therapy, those folks are going through a therapeutic process, and they're learning things about themselves, they're healing traumas, they're revisiting painful situations. And so it's about like, how can I then build my life around those new insights and around that new, actually literally wiring of the brain. And then so that can be done through various practices. And it's really like, the idea of integration is, to me, like I mentioned, I think a couple of times, like about building a life around that, and sort of altering your lifestyle in the orientation of the things that you've learned or that you've gained from that experience. And
Mm,
yeah, one of the things that I often like to share is that in the indigenous cultures where a lot of these medicines come from, the concept of integration is really not even a thing, because it was already part of their lifestyle, and the
mm.
life was already so integrated in community that those people
Ah,
were held and supported. And these were often maybe rites of passage or healing experiences that there wasn't it was so much a part of their culture that it wasn't like you just totally stepped out of,
yeah,
like we're stepping out of Western culture to an
correct.
extent, like the mindset of Western culture into this psychedelic experience, and then trying to bring that back into Western culture. And this lends itself to that question that I started to ask of like, what is that healing that's taking place if we're actually just re-entering into a dirty fishbowl, so to speak, of these systems that we're living in. So it's really important to have the practices and to have the stuff that you can build a life around those.
Yeah, I just want to pause right there. I really love that quote as a definition for integration, building a life around the psychedelic experience that you had. That's it right there. That's kind of how I imagine it as well. That's pretty cool. Just wanted to isolate that nugget right there for the listeners. That's a great definition.
Yeah, thank you. And so I would even then extend that to this cultural integration. Like we're starting to look at how can we build systems, how can we build infrastructure around a psychedelic experience or a psychedelic mindset or a psychedelic life, and how can then impact our communities and our sort of global system. So there's like a micro and macro integration that I personally find very interesting and like to hold that. Yeah, I want to then, I guess, circle back to the Aya roadmap, the IYA that you were speaking to and asking about, integrate your awakening. So that I learned, there was a framework for that I learned from Dr. Dan Engel, who he is an author, a psychiatrist by practice, and he's written several books about brain injuries and recently a book about MDMA therapy. And he also founded a wellness center in Austin, Texas recently. That's a really awesome space. Anyways, I learned that framework from him and then adapted that through some other stuff that I learned in the Czech Institute and Paul Czech. And so I adapted and created this roadmap that can be implemented for integration process. Like I said, prior to, in preparation, and then after in integration. And there's 4 main tenets to that. And it starts with, in a sense, it's based directionally. So you have like north, south, east, and west, like a medicine wheel. And we start in the south, which is reciprocity. And reciprocity can be correlated also to movement. So there's this like give and take in reciprocity. There's also this sense of movement. And so in that, we're looking at like different aspects of movement to prepare the body, starting with the body, starting in a very grounded place to integrate or to prepare, like what kind of movement can be implemented. Maybe it's dance, maybe it's yoga, maybe it's no movement at all, right? Stillness is often still considered to be movement. Maybe it's weightlifting, something that's really grounding the body, either for an experience or from an experience. And then we move around the wheel to responsibility, which is where the notion of diet and mindset comes in. And so that diet is the food that we're taking in, and then also, liquid, that, whether that's water, juices, the alcohol, maybe cutting alcohol out of your life, those kinds of things. What information are you bringing in? And, it's starting to look at like, okay, we're building this sense of reciprocity and this sense of responsibility through some actual practices, like tangible practices, but starting to orient around those concepts, right? And instilling those into our life, building a lifestyle around those ideas of reciprocity, responsibility towards the experience that you're about to have or that you just had, towards the medicine itself, towards the cultures that they come from. Those things then lend themselves to reverence. And that's where these practices of the soul, like meditation, prayer, those kinds of things, where we start to really like move that grounded experience into the sacred and into the experience of the soul. And then through that, we're moving back around to reconnection. So we've got reciprocity, responsibility, reverence, and reconnection. And that reconnection is often expressed as that reconnection to oneself, reconnection to maybe your family, community, and the sort of world at large. And like, how can you then take this new experience of yourself into your family, into your community, repair relationships? Maybe sometimes it's an end of a relationship. Sometimes it can be repairing relationship, negotiating relationships in a different way, setting boundaries for yourself, creating a deeper sense of happiness for yourself through community, through your experience with other people. Then often nature too, like getting out into nature, those types of things. And it's basically a roadmap, so to speak. And it's, I moved it in directionally around this circle, but it's always alive at this, like each part is alive at the same time. It's not a linear process where you're moving really from one to one. It's sort of all happening at once, but there's a bit of a roadmap to how we go about that and to the different practices that correlate to each value, so to speak. And the last piece that I'll add to that is that the process is really about is a shift in worldview. So oftentimes I think the hang up that happens when we come out of a psychedelic experience or even go into it is that, like I said, we're like sort of leaving this like modernity mindset and this like Western framework for a period of time, and then we come back to it. And to really like instill and build a life around that, oftentimes we need a shift in worldview. That can usually express itself as a shift in consciousness from the individual, the I, to the we, the collective.
The collective, yeah.
right? And so this is essentially a process and a practical way to go about in bringing that shift to life and building a life around that shift, and ultimately with that reconnection, and often like creativity being a more connection and more creativity being expressed as outcomes of that.
Got it. That's awesome, man. You kind of summarized it there at the end with what I was kind of thinking. And you recently published a piece, I think like last week also, where you mentioned this, but
Yes.
what Western society, we've built this individualistic me, gimme, I'm different. I'm separate from nature. I'm separate from my neighbor. It sounds like you really focus on the healing for the collective, or healing, the community that's involved with healing. And it's not necessarily just an individual experience. And, we see that a lot with different ancient practices and rituals. It's an entire community experience. And it really sounds like you guys translate that for a Western society in a really, really, really cool way.
Yeah, totally. I mean, you know, I think it's a bell hooks quote that's something along the lines of like, healing doesn't happen in isolation. It oftentimes happens in community. And I think that's so true. Like there's, to an extent, there might be some healing that can happen individually, but it oftentimes comes down to, we aren't really individuals. Like oftentimes we see in the psychedelic experience that interconnectedness, and we're healing relationships in these spaces in some way, shape, or form. We're healing relationships, and that's community. Like you're in communion with somebody else. That's a relationship. And so then doing that in community is really important. And so for the individual, having that community to integrate with is really important. And then we also think with CPE that as a psychedelic community and an ecosystem, like having a really strong sense and infrastructure for what it means to be in community, having shared values, having a shared purpose and a shared meaning, that's how we're going to really be able to integrate these medicines into our healthcare system and start to shift those systems so that we can make these medicines affordable and accessible to anybody and everybody that wants them.
Awesome, man. Like I said, I can't say it enough. You guys are doing really credible, important work, man. Just before, you've been a great guest. So much information. I really hope you guys, the audience, you listeners, took a lot of information from Ross's story. I hope it also was inspiring as well. Now, Ross, one question I always do ask guests, what is your why for being in the psychedelic space? How would you summarize or describe your why for why you are in this work?
Whew. That's a great question, and I really appreciate you asking that. For me, I think that in the piece that I recently published talks about an evolutionary opportunity. I think that in modernity, we've sort of lost our way in a lot of ways. And, some might say that's part of a larger process. Who knows what it is? But for the possible survival of our species and our ecology, like the whole ecosphere, a lot has to change in a very short amount of time. And I think that psychedelics are a tool for that and provide an opportunity to really start to address those things from the individual healing level, and then shifting into that we consciousness and collective, and starting to facilitate that change in worldview that I think can really move towards a healthier, flourishing planet and society. And so for me, that's the why. It's really like, what is my highest contribution that I can make? And at this point in my journey, this is where I've landed, is doing my part in helping create the systems to make these medicines, like I said, accessible and affordable to all that want them, in the direction of this human and planetary flourishing that I think hopefully can help change the course that we're on right now.
Oh man, beautiful, man. Yeah, that's incredible. Well, I guess it's not incredible that like we have a limited amount of time to fix this before before everything falls apart for our species. But it is incredible that that's the reasoning, and this is the type of work that we're in. It's quite a pickle that civilization has gotten ourselves into.
Yes.
And these resources have been here the whole time. But it's dope to see more and more people get involved in this work. Once again, like I said, Ross, you've been a great interview. If you could just let listeners know how they can connect with you and also learn more about CPE as well.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for having me. This has been a great conversation, and I really appreciate the work that you're doing, and that you invited me on here. So CPE, folks can find out more about CPE at our website, Center for Psychedelic Education.com. And through that, there's opportunities to get involved, to join our community, to join a chapter, start a chapter, those types of things. We also have social media handles on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, all the places. If I think Twitter and Facebook, I think we're Center for Psych EDU. Instagram is Center for Psychedelic Education, at Center for Psychedelic Education. And myself, Instagram at Ross G. Sullivan. And you can find me on LinkedIn. You will not find me on Facebook these days. I'm on Twitter as well. But I really encourage folks to check out the CPE website, Center for Psychedelic Education.com, and can also send questions to Center for Psychedelic Education at gmail.com if anybody has any questions and wants to learn more, or wants to know how to get involved. Yeah, we're really looking at inviting more participation now that we're starting to get some serious structure underway. And we want to build community. We want to build participation, participatory culture. And, we have to do it as a community. So
Sure, man. Once again, incredible interview. Ross Sullivan of the Center for Psychedelic Education. Be sure to check him out and check out the organization as well. Once again, Arter Project, another incredible episode. Don't forget to check out our blog, thearterproject.com, for additional information and bonus content following the psychedelic renaissance. But anyway, as I mentioned, another episode, the Arter Project, signing out. Peace.